very good. So people might be a few minutes late because we had a very long discussion in the last talk.
Okay.
You were the last talk, so if it's not a problem for you,
not a problem.
It shouldn't be a problem for us.
Not a problem at all.
Yeah, very good.
In fact, I'm utilizing the time to put the finishing touches on the paper. So.
Okay. Yeah, very good. Go ahead.
So far, so good. Print. Oh, good. My printer's printing it. That's good. That way I don't have to share. I don't have to look at the screen. So all of you can hear me now, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we are now ready to start. Are you all ready?
I'm ready.
To have you with us. It's the last talk of this workshop, and we are very much looking forward to it. We are talking about fictitious existence versus non-existence.
Thank you very much. I apologize that I'm not there in person. I would have loved to be there, but our term ended just yesterday, and I had to teach the final lectures. I had to give the final lectures for my classes just yesterday. So it was impossible for me to be there in person as much as I would have liked to go. I've read many of the abstracts in advance, and I really wish I could have been there for some of those talks. Also, I understand you're having a barbecue right after this. I wish I could have been there for that as well. Dolph, could you tell me how much time I have?
Yeah, so either 45 or 60 minutes, as you prefer.
Okay, well, it's not going to take up that much time. So there'll be more time for discussion, and then everybody's hungry at that point. So we'll see how it goes. This paper, so I was working, when I say that this is a last minute paper, as Dolph can testify, that's literally the case. I was just working on finishing touches right now. I mean, literally seconds ago. And I think that this paper has something for everyone. Now, what I mean by that is for every one of you who can hear this recording or this lecture, there's something in this paper that you will disagree with. I think that's probably the case. It's going to be a series of controversial statements, and I do have arguments for many of them. Um, and perhaps in the Q&A, we can see where we disagree. All right, a true singular negative existential assertion, and by that I mean a correct observation to the effect that A does not exist, where the A is a proper name or some other kind of singular term, could be true on any of a variety of grounds. Typically, a true singular negative existential is true on the unproblematic ground that the subject term A designates something that does not presently exist. More interesting philosophically is a true negative existential statement, more interesting philosophically is a singular negative existential statement in which the subject term A designates nothing at all. So the contrast is between designating something that doesn't currently exist and designating nothing at all. Philosophers interested in the puzzles about true singular negative existentials see this kind of case as the most straightforward ground for the truth of a true singular negative existential. Designation failure is what makes it true, for example, that the present King of France does not exist. This is so, at least on the not unpopular assumption against Russell that definite descriptions, like the present United States president, are routinely designators. Of course, Russell thought they were not, but on the assumption that they are, then this would be an example of a true singular negative existential where the subject term designates nothing at all. Philosophers have assumed that designation failure is likewise the ground on which a negative existential invoking a name from fiction is true. For example, the statement, Sherlock Holmes does not exist, or perhaps Sherlock Holmes does not exist in reality. There are alternative grounds on which a singular negative existential statement can be true. A decidedly different ground is that the term A, in A does not exist, does designate something, but something that is non-existent. A straightforward example of this kind of true singular negative existential statement is the sentence, Socrates does not exist. Of course, the sentence Socrates used to exist or once existed is true, but Socrates does not exist is also true. The name Socrates is not non-designating. It designates Socrates. But Socrates is dead, and he therefore no longer exists. It may still be said, of course, that the name Socrates is non-designating, but only in the weak sense that there does not exist anything that the name designates. In a more robust sense, the name designates something, in fact, someone, the dead white man, Socrates. I say that a term is weakly non-designating if there does not exist anything that it designates, but there might have been something that it actually does designate. That is, there doesn't actually exist anything that it designates, but there's a possible thing, and it actually does designate that merely possible thing. That is to say, a weakly non-designating term does not designate any currently existing thing, but designates a specific possible thing. The name Socrates is a weak non-designator in a very weak sense, since Socrates not only might have existed, but did in fact exist. I say that a weakly non-designating term is very weakly non-designating if there existed or will exist something that the term presently designates. So a past object or a future object. On my own esoteric doctrines, there are things that exist only in worlds that are not possible, not possibly possible, not even possibly possible, and so on. I say that a term is strongly non-designating if there could not have existed a thing such that nevertheless the name actually designates. That's a kind of complicated thought. The name designates something that not only could not have existed, but could not possibly have existed and could not possibly have existed, and so on. Nevertheless, the name designates such a thing. And I think there are, in some sense, there are such impossible, impossibly possible, and so on objects. Finally, I say that a term is very strongly or thoroughly non-designating if it does not designate anything at all. Nothing that existed, nothing that will exist, nothing that might have existed, that never does, nothing that could not have existed, nothing that could not possibly have existed, nothing that could not even have possibly existed, and so on. Assuming that definite descriptions are designators, the term the present King of France is very strongly or thoroughly non-designating. That is to say, it designates nothing at all. If the proper name A is non-designating, whether weakly, very weakly, or strongly, the corresponding singular negative existential statement, A does not exist, is indeed true, but only on the ground that the subject term designates something that doesn't exist. Only in case A, the name A, is very strongly non-designating, is the singular negative existential A does not exist. Only in case A is very strongly non-designating, is the singular negative existential A does not exist true if it is, because the subject term fails to designate anything at all. I confess, however, that it is not clear to me that such a singular negative existential statement is genuinely true, for it seems that it is in fact without any content at all. If it lacks content, then it's neither true nor false. And I'll return to this issue later in this talk. In his book Reference and Existence, which is a transcription of lectures that Kripke gave in 1972 at Oxford, Saul Kripke advances a theory of fictional characters. On his theory, the names from fiction are ambiguous, having both a primary and a secondary use. Kripke distinguishes separate stages, that's what he calls them, stages, in considering a work of fiction. At the first stage, the storyteller goes through the motions of making assertions about various individuals. At this stage, the storyteller does not actually make any assertions about anything. The sentences that make up a written fiction express no propositions, on Kripke's account. It is all merely a pretense. In particular, the fictional names like the name Sherlock Holmes that occur in the fiction, in their primary sense, do not designate anything in reality. By contrast, some names that occur in fiction, for example, the name London, do designate. Still, whereas according to the stories, Holmes resides in London, the storyteller, in this case Arthur Conan Doyle, only pretends to assert that Holmes resides in London, and indeed Conan Doyle pretends to be Dr. Watson, and thereby pretends that he himself resides in London. But whether Conan Doyle actually resides in London is completely beside the point and irrelevant. The pretense concerns Holmes and Watson. It does not concern Conan Doyle. Rather, Conan Doyle and his readers cooperatively engage in the very same pretense. At a later stage, a domain of fictional characters is posited. In particular, a fictional character who might as well be designated as Sherlock Holmes is posited, not a man made of flesh and blood, but an existing abstract object created by Conan Doyle. The name Sherlock Holmes in its secondary sense designates the fictional character. The name in its secondary sense would be better spelled with a subscript of 2, as in Holmes sub 2. At this meta stage, critics and theorists make various true or false assertions about the abstract character. For example, that the character of Holmes was inspired by a real life figure, which is in fact the case. There was somebody named Joseph Bell, and Conan Doyle claimed that his character was inspired by this person that he knew, Joseph Bell. According to Kripke's theory, the Holmes stories invoke the name Holmes only in the primary sense. In that sense, the stories are about Holmes sub 1, not about Holmes sub 2. My own account of fiction overlaps with Kripke's in some respects, but deviates from Kripke's in some important respects. I agree with Kripke that fictional characters are real things, though not real people. Fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes are created by the storyteller. I can also agree with Kripke's distinction between stages concerning a fiction. However, I contend that the abstract objects that are the fictional characters are already present at the initial storytelling stage. Perhaps the most important difference between Kripke and me is this. Kripke holds that the names like Holmes and Watson as they occur in telling the story, for example, in the pages of a particular printing of the story, do not designate anything. They're used in their primary sense. They are empty singular terms. By contrast, on my view, the author's fictional characters actually populate the fiction that the author created. On Kripke's view, Conan Doyle's stories do not make reference to anyone. On my view, too, the stories are not about any person, but on my view, they are about something that is quite real. They are about the character, Holmes, a real existing thing. The stories depict Holmes as a detective. Holmes is not a detective. It is a fictional detective. A fictional detective is like a toy duck, in that the toy is not a duck, but a kind of simulation, a representation of a duck. Holmes is in reality an abstract object, but never mind. According to the stories, Holmes is a detective. On my view, the abstract object is depicted as a human being with extraordinary powers of deduction. In a very real sense, the stories are about the abstract object. The stories make reference to that object, and they are therefore wildly inaccurate. One inaccuracy is the time of Holmes's inception. According to the stories, Holmes was born in 1854, delivered from his mother's womb, presumably conceived approximately 9 months earlier. In reality, Holmes was created at least 30 years later, the brainchild of Conan Doyle's fertile imagination. But this discrepancy is only the tip of the iceberg. The differences between the real Holmes and the fictional Holmes, or rather, between Holmes and how he is depicted in the stories, are vast. The real Holmes never played violin, never took cocaine, never solved a crime, never even had a thought. The real Holmes was never alive, never human, never a person, never a detective. The real Holmes was the property of Conan Doyle, not a slave, but intellectual property. Yet the stories are in a very direct and literal sense about the real Holmes. I think my printer's trying to print more of the paper out. One thorny philosophical difficulty that arises in Kripke's theory of fiction is solved on my own theory. He and I agree that according to the Holmes stories, Holmes was a brilliant detective. What is it then that is so according to the stories? The answer, that Holmes was a brilliant detective. On the surface, that Holmes was a brilliant detective is a proposition. But on Kripke's theory, no such proposition is so, according to the Holmes stories. For on that theory, there is no such proposition, at least not in the usual sense. At best, on Kripke's account, there is what is sometimes called a gappy proposition. And that's what I have called a structurally challenged proposition. That's to say, a would-be proposition, but for a gap or blank spot, a cavity that is supposed to be filled by an individual thing. The problem now is that the proposition that Holmes was a brilliant detective is the same gappy proposition as the proposition that Mickey Mouse was a brilliant detective. Yet it is not true, according to the Holmes stories, that Mickey Mouse was a brilliant detective. It is thus completely mysterious what the claim that, according to the Holmes stories, Holmes was a brilliant detective could amount to on Kripke's account. By contrast, there is no such problem on my account, or even any related problem. What is so, according to the Holmes stories, is a genuine, albeit spectacularly false, proposition that Holmes was a brilliant detective. On my view, the real Holmes does in fact have a related property, entirely by virtue of the fact that, according to the stories, Holmes was a brilliant detective. Holmes is a thing that, according to the stories, was a brilliant detective. Being a thing that, according to the Holmes stories, was a brilliant detective is a genuine property, and Holmes, the fictional character, genuinely has it. What I have said above concerning fiction and its characters goes as well for what I call myths. And by myth, I mean a mistaken theory that has been believed. The luminiferous ether is a mythical substance, the medium through which, according to the myth, light waves propagate. In reality, the ether is an abstract object. Light waves do not propagate through it, but it does have the property that, according to the myth, light waves propagate through it. I actually, in preparing for this morning, it's morning here, by the way, so preparing for the talk this morning, I looked up ether on the internet, and I found this. Let me see if I can share my screen, because this is kind of funny. What's funny is that it's completely accurate. Let me see if I can find it here. Where is it? Here we go. Ether, theoretical substance. Do we see this? This is from the Britannica. It says ether, also spelled aether, also called luminiferous ether in physics, a theoretical universal substance believed during the 19th century to act as the medium for transmission of electromagnetic waves, for example, light and X-rays, much as sound waves are transmitted by elastic media such as air. So here's the interesting thing. This is the Britannica. It labels ether, the luminiferous ether, as a theoretical universal substance. I take that word theoretical to be what I'm calling mythical, a mythical universal substance. And the article says that this mythical substance, which on my view is an abstract object, was believed during the 19th century to act as the medium of transmission for light. So according to the Britannica article, the ether is well, they call it a theoretical substance. I would call it a mythical substance that was believed to be the medium for transmission of light. And all of that, I think, is exactly right. It's exactly right. And let me continue. Likewise, Vulcan is a mythical planet that was hypothesized by this is a little known fact, by an astronomer, or an amateur astronomer, I think he was, named Babinet. But Babinet had convinced Leverrier that there was this planet. It's not a real planet, but it has Babinet, of course, was a famous astronomer. I'm sorry, Leverrier was a famous astronomer. It is not a real planet, but it has the property that, according to the myth, it is a planet whose orbit is inside that of Mercury. For some reason, this account of names from myth is significantly more controversial than my proposed account of fictional names. Some philosophers that are prepared to accept my account of fiction, or at least to consider it as a live contender, flatly reject my account of myth. For the life of me, I don't see any philosophically relevant difference between the two. A myth is simply a story, except one that has been mistaken for the truth. Otherwise, as far as I can tell, there's no difference, and this is not a philosophically relevant difference between myth and fiction. All right. Consider now the statement, Sherlock Holmes does not exist. On my account, this statement is contrary to popular philosophical opinion, not a true singular negative existential. It is a singular negative existential, to be sure, but I contend it is simply false. Holmes does exist. He, really it, is a fictional character, one that has existed continuously ever since his creation by Conan Doyle, who long ago himself ceased to exist. There's a question as to whether Holmes will ever cease to exist, and I think the answer to that is yes. The fictional character will, although it's an abstract object and it was created, it came into being, and it will also go out of being when all human intelligence is gone, if that ever does come to pass, and I'm pretty sure it will. In any case, when all traces of the story are gone, I think the character will disappear at that time. He no longer exists. Given that Sherlock Holmes exists, why do we feel the intuitive pull to say that he does not? My proposed answer is that it is due to a kind of misinterpretation. Unlike Kripke, I do not maintain that the fictional name Sherlock Holmes is ambiguous. Rather, I say the name univocally designates the fictional detective. However, there is a temptation to misinterpret the name as a kind of abbreviated definite description, perhaps an abbreviation of the description, the person who both is Sherlock Holmes and also is more or less as Holmes is depicted in the stories. Let me repeat that description. So I think we sometimes misinterpret the name as if it were an abbreviation for this description. The person who both is Sherlock Holmes and also is more or less as Holmes is depicted in the stories. This description is improper in the technical sense. That is, there is nothing that uniquely answers to it. In particular, the fictional character of Holmes does not answer to that description. The singular negative existential is thus assimilated, perhaps unconsciously, to a case like the present King of France does not exist. That is, a singular negative existential in which the subject term does not designate at all anything. The description does not designate something that does not exist, nor something that does exist, nor even a fictional character, but designates nothing at all. Now, as I intimated earlier, it's generally taken for granted by philosophers that a singular negative existential A does not exist, in which the subject term A designates nothing at all, is a paradigm case of a true singular negative existential. However, there's a real question whether this is correct. Consider the unnegated form A exists. If A does not exist is true, and the adverb not is ordinary internal or so-called choice negation, then the unnegated statement A exists is false. On the surface, and I contend in point of fact, the sentence A exists is an atomic subject predicate sentence of the form F-A, with the verb exists being the monadic predicate F. Arguably, and I contend in point of fact, an atomic subject predicate sentence F-A is not simply false if the subject term A designates nothing at all. Rather, such a sentence would seem to be without truth value, neither true nor false. And if it is neither true nor false, then so too is its ordinary negation, not F-A, negation sign F-A. If that is correct, then my proposed explanation of the stubborn but wayward intuition that the sentence Sherlock Holmes does not exist is true cannot be the whole story. If the name Sherlock Holmes is confused with the improper description, the person who both is Holmes and more or less as Holmes is depicted, why then does the singular negative existential not seem to be neither true nor false? And in particular, not true. To this question, I would reply that the adverb not is also reinterpreted as so-called external or exclusion negation. That is, the negation, it is not the case that. It's a stronger form of negation. This form of negation converts any untrue sentence, whether it be false or without truth value, into a true one. In short, I propose the sentence Sherlock Holmes does not exist is misinterpreted as meaning that the person who both is Sherlock Holmes and more or less as Holmes is depicted in the stories exists. That proposition is true, and obviously so, given that no one in reality is as Holmes is depicted in the stories. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. As I promised you, there was going to be something for every one of you. There's something I've said that you probably already disagree with. Some of my readers have objected to my account of fiction on the ground that they find it excessively far-fetched to suppose that a fiction represents an abstract object as a person, let alone as a brilliant detective. I believe this objection is ultimately based on a straightforward scope fallacy of the sort that Russell cautioned against. Of course, it's not true that according to the corpus of Holmes stories, some abstract object is a brilliant detective. That would be a surreal fiction indeed. What is true is this. There is some abstract object X, specifically the fictional character of Sherlock Holmes, such that according to the fiction, that very object X is not an abstract object at all, but a brilliant detective, a man made of flesh and blood. final point concerns the distinction between specific and generic names. Upon birth, my parents named me after my paternal grandfather, whose name was, like mine, Nathan Salmon. Actually, it was Nathan Salmon, but I have that same name, Nathan Salmon. The name that my grandfather and I share is a generic name. I dare say others might also have been given that same generic name. The name Nathan Salmon or Nathan Salmon used to designate me is a specific name rather than a generic one that the name Nathan Salmon used, whereas the name Nathan Salmon used to designate my grandfather is a different specific name. Analytical-minded readers are wont to distinguish the two specific names by means of subscripts or by means of some other syntactic mark, as for example, Nathan Salmon the Younger, as opposed to Nathan Salmon the Elder. In telling his iconic stories, Conan Doyle introduced a specific use for the generic name Sherlock Holmes. The specific name Sherlock Holmes, which Conan Doyle introduced, designates the fictional character of Sherlock Holmes. At least that's what I claim. However, in telling the stories, Conan Doyle did not use the specific name he introduced in order to designate Holmes and to assert a mountain of falsehoods about the character. Conan Doyle did not assert anything in telling the stories, at least not in the robust sense of assert, on which one is committed by one's assertions to their truth. The corpus of Conan Doyle's Holmes stories have the unusual feature that the sentences are put forward not from the point of view of the omniscient narrator, but rather from the point of view of a character in the stories, Dr. Watson. They're written in the first person as if being told by Dr. Watson. In telling the stories, Conan Doyle engages in a pretense. In particular, he portrays himself as Watson, much as an actor on the stage might portray the character. According to the story, Watson asserts many things about Holmes, as well as many things about himself. Conan Doyle himself, in portraying Watson, does not actually assert anything at all. Conan Doyle thereby repeatedly writes the specific name Holmes, but nowhere does Conan Doyle actually use the name to designate anything at all. Rather, he writes the specific name, pretending thereby to designate a living, breathing human being. But it's all a pretense. And there I agree with Kripke, it's all pretense. Actually, many philosophers of fiction have also postulated this idea, probably starting with Frege, that storytelling, fiction telling, is pretense, form of pretense. There is a difference between fiction and myth here in this case. Unlike the storyteller, the mistaken theorist asserts falsehood. Leverrier intended to use the name Vulcan as a specific name for an intramercurial planet. However, in uttering the name, he referred to the hypothesized planet. Unlike the case of Neptune, in this case, the hypothesized planet is not a planet. It's a mythical planet, but it's not a planet. In uttering a French sentence for the English sentence, Vulcan is the closest planet to the sun, Leverrier did not assert anything about any real planet, but he asserted something about the mythical planet, something false. In so doing, unbeknownst to him, Leverrier used the name Vulcan, the specific name Vulcan, to refer to a supposed planet, something that is in reality an abstract object. Okay, that's all I have for you today. So go ahead and take over as chair, Dolph.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that talk. The discussion is open at 9 is the first.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I might have to ask you to repeat, but yes, I do hear you.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask about your suggestion as to what uses of negative existential statements like Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, what they convey. So I guess I'm assuming this in case this happens, right? When people deny, when people say X doesn't exist, and they're talking about what they think is a fictional character, that this, you're suggesting this sort of thing goes on. So I'm thinking about a strange case. So let me spell it out, okay? So in my imagined scenario, I think that Lord Byron doesn't exist, that fiction character. Okay. Also, in my strange case, Lord Byron isn't the way that he's depicted. You know, we all think of him as a famous libertine. In fact, he was a really boring guy. Okay.
Let me see if I get this straight so far. You're imagining someone who thinks Lord Byron doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But also, what was the second thing?
In the scenario I'm imagining, Lord Byron is not the way that he's depicted.
In reality.
Yeah, he's really boring.
Okay.
So your proposal is that what this, me in my example, would convey by the denial that Byron exists is, so wide scope negation. It's not the case that the person who is both Byron and is more or less as Byron is depicted exists.
Mm-hmm.
And in my example, that's true.
Right, because of the second conjunct, you mean?
So in my example, it's true to say, if I'm laboring under the misapprehension that Byron doesn't exist, fiction character, and I say Byron doesn't exist, in your analysis I've said something true, even though in that case Byron does exist. He's just...
He does, yeah.
Okay.
So by the way, to whom am I speaking? I don't see who you are.
Oh yeah, Niall Connolly.
Okay. Now I'm not sure I get the exact case that you're talking about. I think I understand the scenario, and I think it's a scenario in which the misinterpretation of Byron does not exist turns out to be true, not because, well, it is for the same reason that Byron isn't as he's depicted. Isn't that right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Now, that doesn't make the sentence Byron does not exist true. By the way, Byron doesn't exist, but let's forget about tense.
Yeah. Sorry, imagine I'm living.
Yeah, I imagine some living writer. So what I'm saying is that the sentence Sherlock Holmes does not exist is false, in my view. But there is an intuitive pull in the direction of asserting it anyway, and believing it to be true. Sherlock Holmes does not exist, and I say that's because it's a misinterpretation, and the misinterpretation, the proposition that people take it to express, is in fact a true proposition. And I guess what you have is a scenario in which an exactly analogous proposition is true for a similar reason, that the writer in question is not as he's depicted, maybe in the press, for example. But the sentence Byron exists, or sorry, Byron does not exist, is false, right? I guess maybe your question is, why don't we also misinterpret that sentence? Does that seem like?
Yeah, take it as an either or. You know, if we do also misinterpret that sentence, then that's, you know, then your analysis applies, and it's a counterexample. And the other one of the dilemma is, why don't we misinterpret in that case too?
I'm not sure. So I'm not actually hearing everything that you're saying, so I'm probably missing a lot of the important nuances of your observations and your remark. I can see a problem here, something like this. We think the sentence Byron does not exist is straightforwardly false, and we have no similar misinterpretation and no similar intuition that Byron does not exist is true. Although the analogous proposition that I claim is what we interpret Sherlock Holmes does not exist to mean is true, right? Yeah. Why don't we misinterpret it so that it comes out true, or so we think that it comes out true? Hard to say. I suppose it's probably because we believe in Byron, and many people, most people, don't believe in this fictional character. I think so. Here, let me throw this out there and see what you think about this. Common sense tells us that the actual people that are alive do exist. I think common sense is neutral on a lot of questions that philosophers do consider. That is, common sense doesn't say yes and doesn't say no. It's just completely neutral. I think on the existence of fictional characters as abstract objects, I don't think common sense rejects that, but I think common sense is neutral about that. It just doesn't say yes or no to this theory that there are fictional characters that are abstract entities. And maybe the neutrality of common sense is playing a role here as to why we don't misinterpret that sentence. I'm not sure, but that's sort of where I'd be inclined to go. That it's, common sense doesn't say that there is a character of Sherlock Holmes, but common sense does say that there's Byron or whoever the writer is.
Yeah, okay, I won't badge you. I'll think about that. Thanks.
All of a sudden, I can hear you extremely clearly. I don't know what changed, but now
well,
I can.
Right in front of the mic, you can.
That's what happened. Yeah, that's very helpful. If you stand in front of the mic, I have a much better. I can process what you're saying a lot easier. Okay. Thank you for your question. I'll think more about that because that is an issue that needs to be. I need to think about that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, Nathan. It's Graham.
Hi, Graham. Good to see you.
Good to see you, even though it's virtual.
Yes.
Okay. Look, here's a thought. Let me make sure I've got your view right first, okay?
Yeah.
So, Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. Prima facie, that comes out false on your view.
Right.
What you do is you stick in a clause, as is, namely, Sherlock Holmes, as described in the fiction, doesn't exist, and that's true.
Yeah, the thing that is Sherlock Holmes and is as described in the fiction does not exist, and that's true. Yes.
In all the work is adding this clause as described in the fiction, right?
Yeah, right. That's doing the work. Yeah.
All right.
I mean, I think the first clause is also doing some work, but.
Now let's suppose I tell a story, and in this story there's an object, and in the story, let's call it Fred. Okay, Fred is a non-existent object.
It's a story about a non-existent object, as it were.
Okay, so
right.
The object is depicted as non-existent.
As depicted. Uh-huh.
So in the story, the object as depicted is non-existent.
Yeah, I see where you're going with this. I'm trying to think through what is it to tell a story. So according to the story, Fred doesn't exist.
Yeah. So
it's not that according to the story, Fred is a past object or a future object.
Fred, I mean, leave tense out of this. It's not relevant.
Not relevant. So I'm telling a story, or you're telling a story in which there's a character, Fred, and it's part of the story that Fred has never existed.
Yep. So the object as depicted in the story doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So the claim that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I can see the problem that you're getting at. It's strange to have a story in which there is a character who does not exist, but I suppose you could do that. I don't see anything that's going to block that from happening. I can see the problem, Graham. By the way, one interesting case in fiction where there's, I think this is a great philosophical example that's similar to yours, and that's the movie The Fight Club. And I don't know if everybody has seen The Fight Club, and I don't want to ruin it. I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't seen it, since I'm recommending it. Is there anybody here who hasn't seen it and might want to see it? Oh, I'm so sorry. So I don't know what to say about this. It's rather like Graham's case, but even that's a bit of a spoiler. Okay, geez, I'm not sure what to do. Cup your ears as I tell you a little bit about this. But in the movie The Fight Club, yes, there's a protagonist who is never named. We don't know what his name is throughout the entire movie. We never find out what his name is. There's another character in the movie, and we do know his name. It's Tyler Durden. And there's a question as to whether Tyler Durden is the protagonist. One hypothesis is that it is. Another hypothesis is that Tyler Durden doesn't even exist, according to the story. That Tyler Durden is a non-existent person, according to the story, right? And so that would make it rather like the story that Graham is asking me to consider here, where there's a character, there's an actual piece of the story that's depicted as non-existent in the story itself. I don't think that is a case of this, and so that's why I'm having a little bit of a hard time getting my mind around the idea of a character who's in the story, but in the story doesn't exist. It's a strange story, a strange kind of story.
I'm sure I could have give me an afternoon, okay? But I mean, take Waiting for Godot. I mean, how you interpret it is, of course, contentious. But on some interpretations, Godot doesn't exist.
Some interpretations, who doesn't exist?
Godot, in Waiting for Godot.
Okay.
Okay. But I mean, I'm sure I could write a story about a non-existent object. Wouldn't be difficult.
Oh,
right?
yeah, no, I don't think that it can't be done. I'm just having a hard time getting my mind wrapped around that idea. There does feel like some tension because, according to the story, there is this character, and I suppose it's a person, right?
No, the story is about some character, and it's part of the story that this character doesn't exist.
Is the character a person according to the story?
Could be, doesn't matter. I mean, you might think of the story as Meinong's theory.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about this case. It's an extreme case. It's a hard case. If you can use this kind of consideration to push me in the direction of changing the description, I'm okay with that. So I posited as a description that we misinterpreted the name Holmes to be the person who is Holmes and is also as depicted in the stories. And if you can push me in the direction of saying, well, it's going to have to be more sophisticated than that, I'm okay with that. I mean, I'm very interested in what the description is. But I still think that the intuition that Sherlock Holmes does not exist for those who have it. I take it. Graham, do you have that intuition yourself?
Look, the point I think will generalise. I mean, just sticking in the clause as described in the story, if you're telling the story about something that satisfies a certain condition, it's going to make the sentence true, so it's negation false, which is not what you want. And whatever clause you stick in there, maybe it's more complicated than as characterised in the story. Mm-hmm. You could tell a story in which the thing satisfies that condition. So it kind of generalizes to any clause you might want to stick in.
I am not sure that that's true. I mean, I really have to think this through, but maybe that's true for conditions of the form as depicted in the stories. But maybe we can come up with some other condition, not that one, and that it will not make sense to say that there's a story in which the character has that feature.
Maybe that. I mean, I admit that possibility, but I'm also pretty confident about my ability to write stories.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I don't want to deny creativity. at all here. Yes, you could do that. Yeah.
Just have a thing on this. Couldn't you rephrase your claim as Sherlock Holmes, as described in the story, doesn't actually exist, and it would also work with Graham's case. It's described as non-existent in the fiction, but it does not actually exist. That's what we want to say. And maybe we can be anaphoric. So this Sherlock Holmes, as described in this story, shifts Sherlock Holmes, but the anaphora could also go outside, and then we could say, or we could just say that actually scopes out. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing what function actually is doing here. Just repeat. Say that again, Dolph.
So if it's described as non-existent in the story,
Yeah.
It nevertheless might not actually exist, this Sherlock Holmes, as it is described in the story, but actually is not actually in the story, because
Actually means in reality here.
yeah, in reality, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not the it's not actually the modal the indexical use of actually as a modal indexical. It really means in reality.
Yeah, okay, in reality. So this figure of Graham, as it described in the story, it's described as non-existent. In reality, it doesn't exist. I think that's fine. It doesn't exist.
I'm probably missing something because no matter what you mean by in reality, Graham can tell a story in which there's something that, according to the story, does not exist in reality.
Yeah,
Is that right?
we can have some operator that gets us out of the story back to the actual world.
I see where you're trying to go, Dolph.
Okay.
I'm not convinced that there is any such operator.
Okay.
That you can say, according to the story P, but in reality Q, where that's in the scope of according to the story. You understand what I'm saying? So according to the story, conjunction P conjoined with, but in reality not P, or in reality Q. I think you can build that into your story.
Yeah.
And so I don't see that there's any operator that's going to always scope out. I mean, whatever it is, put it into your story. That is the kind of thing that Graham is suggesting.
Yeah, but I thought that as described in the story doesn't mean the same as according to the story, but it's just a modifier. It doesn't have necessarily the wider scope. So according to the story, it has the scope of the whole sentence.
Yeah.
But at least Sherlock Holmes, as according to the story, does not exist, can be passed in two different ways. And then, so to speak, the question is whether we have some anaphoric, we can say, the Sherlock Holmes, as according to the story, it does not really exist, and if the scope is just Sherlock Holmes, and the question is whether we can have a pronoun that refers to the Holmes in the story, and we in reality predicate on this that it doesn't exist. So, well, yeah. Now, this doesn't.
I mean, we could say something like this. I don't know if this is relevant, but we can say something like this. According to the Conan Doyle stories, Sherlock Holmes is smarter than Albert Einstein actually was.
Yeah, that's.
Now the story doesn't mention Einstein.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So, but you want some kind of operator that takes you out of the according to the story operator. So according to the stories, Sherlock Holmes was smarter than Albert Einstein in reality was, right? It's hard to know what the logical form of that sentence is because on the surface, if you give, according to the story, the widest scope, then it says something false about what's true according to the story, since the stories don't mention Albert Einstein at all. They don't make any comparison without who hasn't even been born yet. But yet we can make sense of that somehow.
Yeah, but in a model operator, we can also put actually, and then it gets out. Maybe according to fiction, is more hyper-intentional, but there should also be an operator that gets us out. I don't see model case an operator that gets us out. The actual operator can get us out and back to the actual world, even though the rest is in the scope. So it's possible that something is actually something, or possible there's someone. It's possible that someone is actually blah blah blah. That gets us out. Yeah. So it should also be possible to have an operator that gets us out of a fiction operator. I do not see why it's impossible.
But why can't you tell a story in which whatever that operator expresses, some proposition has it? Do you understand my question? Whatever that thing is, why can't you incorporate it into a story?
Yeah, certainly there might be two senses of reality, one in the story and one that gets us out. Yeah.
Maybe that's a way around it. I don't know. I have to think. By the way, in the Einstein case, I think there is probably a way to get around this, but it's going to probably postulate intelligence as a thing, and so a degree of intelligence maybe. So you could say there's a degree of intelligence that Einstein has, and according to the stories, Holmes has a greater degree of intelligence than that. Yeah. And that, I think, captures what we're trying to get at when we say, according to the stories, Holmes was smarter than Einstein really was, right? Yeah. But you have to postulate this entity, the degree of intelligence, which I have no problem. I think that's fine. That at least makes sense of this. But if you have some operator that always takes you out, always scopes out somehow, it's hard for me to see how you can prevent a story from involving that feature in some way. I just don't see how you can prevent that.
Yeah. I do not want to have let other people also say so. So it was Andrea was the next.
Okay, thanks. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks a lot for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. Great things, really. I have many things in my mind now, but I would like to advance a suggestion about Graham's example. I think we should distinguish two cases here. Now, the first case is the Fight Club case. So Tyler is, I'm sorry for the spoiler again. Tyler is, say, a hallucinated man in the story. Yeah. That is how I interpreted the movie. Okay. Yeah. I think that this case does not pose a problem to your view. The name Tyler designates a fictional object. And of this fictional object, it is said in the movie that the object is a hallucinated man. Just like of the fictional object Sherlock Holmes, it is said in the story that that object is a detective, right? So
so let me just repeat what you're saying. So according to the story, the protagonist is a real person, whereas Tyler Durden is a fictional or
yeah, according to the story, Tyler is let's say hallucinated person.
Hallucination, yeah.
And I don't think that this poses a problem to your view, because you can say the name designates a fictional object of which it is said in the story that it is a hallucinated man, right? Yeah. That's the first case. The second case is a sort of Moloch-like case, but within a fiction. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you're familiar with the Moloch case.
I am somewhat, yes, yeah. But I got it from Kripke. Is that where it's coming from?
Yeah, exactly. So you might have a case like Moloch case, but in the fiction. And I guess that this case is close to the kind of example Graham was gesturing to. Okay. Yeah. Now, so I tell a story and I keep speaking about this Moloch, let's say, but at the end of the story, you find out that I was not speaking of an individual at all. I was speaking of, I was using the name as a common noun for something else. Okay, very difficult, as you say, but perhaps possible, right? So a Moloch-like case, but within a fiction. Now, this case may be problematic to your view, and this leads me to a question. how do you treat the Moloch case, the original one, not the Moloch case within fiction? Or if you have, because the point is that if you have a theory about that case, then I guess that it would apply to the case of Moloch in the fiction. Because I guess that the strength of your view is that you don't make a sharp distinction between inside the story and outside the story. So if you have a theory about the real Moloch case, then you have a solution also to the Moloch case in the fiction. Let's call it the Graham's case. Yeah, right?
So can I say something about this? Because I'm afraid we're going to keep going, and I wanted to say something about this.
No. I'm done.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So let's see. I want to disagree a little bit with what you said. So first of all, I agree with the first half of what you said, which is the Tyler Durden thing. That doesn't really create a problem for me. The Moloch case is complicated, and I don't think it's a virtue of my view that I don't draw a sharp distinction between inside the story and outside the story. I think it's actually a virtue of my view that I do draw such a sharp distinction. So according to the story, Holmes is human being, brilliant detective. In reality, he's none of those things. He's an abstract object. He doesn't, he's not even gendered. So in reality, now Moloch, as I recall the case, the name Moloch appears in some ancient texts or something, and there are two different theories as to what it refers to. One thinks that it's a god, maybe, something like that. And the other theory, which turns out to be correct, is that no, it's not even a mythological being. It's some kind of ritual or something.
Yeah, or a king or whatever.
Yeah, I don't remember what it was. The first theory, which turned out to be incorrect, created a mythical being, on my view now, right? So as somebody puts forward the theory that Moloch is a god, a mythological god, that mistaken theory is itself a myth, right? And it's a myth about a myth. So that mistaken theory, on my view, does result in a mythical being named Moloch, right? It's a mistaken theory. There isn't one, but the theory created one. Okay. So yeah, I would incorporate that to deal with this very complicated case.
Can I say something about
that? Yes, of course.
When I said that you don't draw a sharp distinction, I meant that after all, the name, for semantic purposes, it's not a big distinction, because the name, what we care about when we're doing semantics is the fact that the name designates the same individual.
What I would put, if I may, I would put it this way. I think it's a disadvantage or a shortcoming of Kripke's theory that he postulates an ambiguity in names, and I don't. I said, no, these names are not in any relevant way ambiguous. Maybe there are irrelevant ambiguities, but there's not a relevant ambiguity. And so I think that is a virtue of my view over Kripke's. I hesitate to put this in terms of a distinction between within the story and outside the story, but I just don't think there's an ambiguity.
Actually, the advantage is also that you avoid the ambiguity between those two senses, but also there is also a third sense in which for him is ambiguous, because in the negative existential, it seems that it has, in Kripke's case, it has to have some sort of intentional or quasi-intentional use, which contradicts the very purpose of the direct reference story. So, right, and in your case, you don't have this problem.
So you're referring to a passage in Reference and Existence, which I think of as the weakest link in that entire book, where he says maybe we have to postulate a quasi-intentional use and so on. That strikes me as just conceding that theory doesn't do.
Yeah, but I wonder whether Graham now agrees that there is a solution to that case inside the fiction. Because if the Moloch case inside the fiction is analogous, well, on your view, I guess that if you have a theory for the standard Moloch case, then you have a theory for the Moloch case inside the fiction. So there is no problem with stories about non-existent objects in this case, right? So that was my point, and I'm happy that you have a theory about Moloch as well. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, as I'm trying to think through Graham's case, as I'm thinking through it, let's see, is there a long list of other people who want to ask questions? Because I want to go back to Graham.
Yeah.
Maybe let's just hear from Maria first, and then
Thanks a lot.
if there's time.
It is actually to the same point. I also think that as far as I can see, I agree with Andrea that Graham's example should not pose a problem for you, but let me get clear whether I have understood your position correctly. As I have understood it, you claim two things. First, fictitious objects exist. They are sort of abstract objects. And second, they do not exist as described in their stories. Correct?
Yeah, although maybe you can describe a story where a fictional object is a fictional object, right? And that may
right,
be okay,
right, exactly. So that was I wanted to make 2 points. The first is that a fictitious object that is described as non-existent should not pose a problem for you, because the fictitious object is described within the story as non-existent, and it isn't non-existent according to your view. So your principle that the object is not as it is described in the story is just kept valid. So
thank you. I'll buy that.
Okay,
I'll take that. Yeah, that does seem
but the problem, a problem may arise. A problem that was probably in the mind of Graham when he posed that objection, is the problem of fiction within fiction. There may be a story, for instance, about an author who struggles with creating a fictional character, and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah.
And finally, he succeeds. But then, so story about an author and fictional characters created. So, well, and then it seems that is at least a counter example to the claim that a fictional object does not exist as it is described in the fiction.
Of course, a fictional object might.
Yes, I don't think actually that it is a real problem with you. I think
yeah,
that
I agree.
there
I
are
see where
more
you're going.
serious problems. But that is
by the way, so I mentioned the movie The Fight Club, and I apologize to you, Maria, because we have spoiled it.
I will
for you.
forget that immediately.
But there's another movie that raises these kinds of ontological issues, and that's the Woody Allen movie, and I think it's called The Purple Rose of Cairo.
That is.
Yeah, and is that the movie in which
yeah.
One of the main characters falls in love with a fictional character?
Yeah, there are many cases in literature where
there are probably many cases.
with this, at least cases where it is unclear whether a certain character is existent or a mere figment of the imagination of somebody.
Yeah, but if I'm correct about the Purple Rose of Cairo, this
is very complicated.
That the woman falls in love with is a fictional character. She even describes him that way. She says, I've fallen in love. Well, he's a fictional character, but nobody's perfect.
Yeah,
the typical Woody Allen joke. Anyway, this fictional character walks off the movie screen.
Right. Yes.
And so, is he a fictional character according to the story? I think the answer is yes, but according to the story, fictional characters can become non-fictional.
The world of that fiction is a very, very strange world.
It's a strange, but
where the limits between fiction and non-fiction are not strict.
It's blurred, but it's coherent. It's a coherent story because we watch it and we are entertained by it. It's not as if we think. I mean, maybe philosophers think, wait a minute, but you can follow the storyline, and it's a part of the story that a fictional character magically transforms into a real person, or I'm not sure exactly, but it seems to be that's the case. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, I think you're probably right. Graham, what do you think about this? That Maria's solution is that this isn't really a problem for me.
Look, I think you can tweak the details in a number of ways, but the main thought is this: the way you get out of the problem is by adding this clause, something like as described in the fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and as long as that's false, that the thing isn't as described in the fiction by your theory, you're out.
Yeah.
The thought is that whatever this clause is, you can tell a story about which the thing in question is as described in the fiction. And how you tweak the rest of the details strikes me as, not so important.
So you had raised two different issues, Graham, if I remember correctly. One was that one, and then the other one was about a story about a non-existent character.
I maybe running those together.
And I think what Maria was saying was the second thing isn't a problem. Because in my view, according to the story, this character doesn't exist, but in reality, it does.
The prime thought is just that whatever this clause is, you can tell a story about which this thing is as described in the fiction.
Yeah, that's your first objection. Yeah,
that's what I should have tried to articulate properly.
Yeah, I mean, maybe what I need to do is replace, you know, more or less. I said something like the person who both is Holmes and is more or less as Holmes is depicted in the story. I can replace that second conjunct with and is a brilliant detective who lives on Baker Street in London, blah, 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 that is specifically mentioned the various things that he's depicted as in the story, right? Rather than generalizing and saying, as he is depicted, saying, brilliant detective lives on Baker Street with, you know, and solves such and such crimes. And I can say that our temptation to think that Sherlock Holmes does not exist comes from misinterpreting it to mean it's not the case that the person who is Sherlock Holmes and who is a brilliant detective, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, Holmes, but it's not going to work in general because whatever clause you stick in, you can write a fiction in which that actually holds. So
yeah, it might be difficult. Let me just think that through because, I mean, one of the things that Holmes, according to the story, is a non-fictional person, but a real person, right? Can you write a story about a fictional character who is a fictional?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah. Let's see.
It's actually a boring story, and I forget the title, but it's about a man who dreams another man into existence. This other man is a fiction. The punchline of the story is that this guy realizes that he's been dreamed into existence. So he's a non-existent object.
Was this an episode of The Twilight Zone? Because I remember an episode of The Twilight Zone. I'm old enough to remember these things. Rod Serling, I think. And it was a brilliant episode of The Twilight Zone where somebody's able to create people by typing a description out on his typewriter. It's a magic typewriter. Then he discovers that he himself is one of them. He was created in this very same way.
Same idea, yeah.
Yeah. My guess is that there'll still be some way to get around it, but it's going to maybe depend on the details of the story. But anyway, I thank you for this because it's a real challenge. I certainly see that. But I think Maria's right about the second thing, that's not a problem for me.
Just
by the way, Maria, I'm sorry that I missed your.
No,
you talked about
just
serious
a very small footnote on that thing. There is quite a famous play from an Italian author whose name I can't recollect at the moment. But the title of the play is "5 Characters Are Looking for an Author."
Ah.
Perhaps that would be a case in point.
I mean, in a certain sense, Descartes was worried about this. How does he know that he's not a fictional character? And his answer was the cogito. I mean, in a certain sense, that's a way of looking at what Descartes was doing. And famously, or infamously, Hintika argued that the cogito is invalid if you regard it as an inference, precisely because he says Hamlet thought, but Hamlet didn't exist. I think he got that exactly wrong in both respects. That is, on my view, Hamlet didn't think, and Hamlet did exist. Precisely the opposite of what Hintika said. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but maybe it's not relevant.
Sorry. Yes. Well, my question is actually related to Andrea's question and concerns the other problematic case that occurs in Kripke's lecture that concerned the name Snazzo. that name is described by Kripke as a name that Kripke completely makes up. So there is no fiction that is involved there, and it seems to be a case of, if it is a name, of a genuinely empty proper name. So
is this the case where Kripke says that somebody tries to avoid paying the bill by saying, my friend Fred is in the bathroom, he's going to pay the bill, and then he leaves the restaurant? But there's no Fred, it's all...
Now, I don't remember the detail. I just remember the Kripke says that the name is completely made up. So it should be a case in your account, if I got it right, of a name that is completely non-referring, utterly non-referring. So I guess that if this is the case, the corresponding positive existential for you should be neither false nor true, right? Snazzo exists. But then what I want to ask you is whether your intuition is that the negative existential in this case is also neither true nor false, because it's very hard to find a description here that can play the sort of game that it plays in the case of Holmes, in order to make it the case that what is conveyed by a sentence like Holmes does not exist enough to be true, right? Yeah. So in case there is no chance of finding a proper definite description that allows Snazzo does not exist to turn out to convey something false. So sorry, true.
Let me try to construct such a case and see if you can raise your question. So I actually, in another paper, suggested, let's suppose somebody introduces the name Louis as a name whose reference is to be fixed by description. And the description is the present King of France. So somebody says, let's use the name Louis as a name, not a description, but it's a name whose reference is to be fixed by the description, the present King of France. And so the name designates the present King of France, if there is one, who's uniquely a present King of France, and is otherwise non-designating. Okay, so the name Louis is non-designating because of the fact that there's no present King of France. And now what about the sentence Louis does not exist, or even Louis does exist? Let's start with Louis does exist, the positive existential. And my intuition is that's neither true nor false. Louis does exist. Many people will have the intuition that it's false, and I don't have that intuition. So I say it's neither true nor false, because it doesn't really, in my view, express anything at all, but at least not a non-gappy proposition. But what about Louis does not exist? Now there, a lot of people are going to have the intuition that that's true.
Right.
And my response to that is, if the negation is what you call it, narrow scope, or what I called internal negation, it's not true. But there is another negation. There's external negation, or wide scope negation, or whatever you want to call it. It is not the case that. And I do agree that it is not the case that Louis exists, because the proposition that Louis exists is this gappy proposition, or this structurally challenged proposition. And of course, that isn't the case. That proposition is not something that's true, right? So
but
that would be,
Isn't this that both the proposition so meant it is not the case that Louis exists, and it is not the case that Snazzo exists, mean exactly the same, right?
Yeah, I suppose that's true. But I'm okay with that. I mean, as people know my work, I'm okay with stuff like that. Yeah, yeah. I guess they would mean the same thing. Yeah, that if you take any two empty names that are genuinely empty, they don't name. Like the name Socrates is not an empty name. It names something that existed, even though he doesn't exist. But take two genuinely empty names. Yeah, I think alpha exists and beta exists. Actually express the same gappy proposition or structurally challenged proposition. no matter how the descriptions that introduce those names, no matter how much they differ, as long as they're both improper.
Yeah, so I just want to make the remark that it seems to me that treating not as basically linguistic negation or external negation is very plausible linguistically because that kind of use of negation generally requires focus on not, but you don't have that in this case. So, like if you say Sherlock Holmes does not smoke because Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, that's okay, but you have to focus not. So Sherlock Holmes doesn't smoke because Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. That doesn't sound right. But when you say Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, you don't have to focus not at all. In neither of these cases, you don't see any need to focus on not. So it doesn't seem to me that there's any linguistic evidence for this kind of metalinguistic negation, which does exist, but it requires a special kind of focus.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought through on this focus idea, but one thing that is interesting about the operator is not the case that, and that is it invokes the word not. And so it's got to, I'm thinking that, it is not the case that S, where S is a sentence, really means that S is not the case. So is the case is a kind of truth predicate, and it's ordinary internal negation. So you're negating the truth predicate and applying that negated predicate to a proposition, that S.
It's not true or something. I would maybe.
Yeah. It's not true that the present King of France is bald. That seems right. Yeah. Whereas the present King of France is not bald, well, that's problematic. But it's not true that the present King of France, that seems fine.
Yeah. So you were supposed to analyze X, it does not exist. And so for that.
Yeah. I think we often do use this external negation or this wide scope negation. And by the way, even Frege could have had it, could have incorporated this into his. He thought that he had a kind of weak three-valued logic, but that's because he didn't think in terms of the this operator. But he could have incorporated this external negation into a system as an ungarata, as an indirect operator.
If you have a predicate that's not an existence predicate, then you have to focus not in order to get the external negation reading. But with existence predicates, you don't do that. So that is, I think, a clear kind of missing factor. There are particular conditions on negation when it can be used as negative.
So I've heard this example. I didn't have dinner with the present King of France last night. I did not have dinner with the present King of France last night. See, there's an intuition that that's true. I'm not sure what to say about that. What I have the strong intuition about is if you have a non-designating term like the present King of France and a simple monadic predicate, that's going to be neither true nor false. But this one involves a more complicated predicate. I had dinner with last night, so I'm not sure what to say about that.
That's focus or not? It not have to.
Yeah.
Okay. I have one question about the myths. You said it's a story, but it's also force theory. So does it turn at some point to a story that is not a fiction, or is it from a force theory story, or what? Maybe it's just a clarification.
I'm sorry, Dolph. I couldn't make out much of what you were saying. I think it's maybe due to the mask, but I followed some of it.
As you said, so the myth story is similar. So a myth is for you a force theory.
That's right.
The myth case is similar to the fictional case because myths are like are certain stories, but not fictional stories.
Right.
But theories, are they really stories?
Well, I don't see a relevant difference between a theory and a story. let's say between a fiction and a myth, there is a difference between them. On my view, a myth was believed, has been believed, whereas the fiction may not have been believed at all. Of course, there are some fictions where people got confused and thought that they were not fictions. One of the most famous example, I think, is this Orson Welles case of the War of the Worlds, where he presented it as a radio, as if it were news bulletins about Martians. So it was a hoax, basically. In the case of a hoax, you're blurring the line between myth and fiction. But there is this difference between myth and fiction. Myths are theories, mistaken theories that were believed. Fictions, at least routinely, are not believed. But I don't see that as a relevant difference. I don't see that why we should be willing to embrace fictional characters and not be willing to embrace mythical objects on the same grounds.
So I see the difference between the hoax case and the fictional case, because there's some pretense there also, but I do not think a theory pretends something or so, and it is.
There's no pretense. That's right. You're right that there's no That is, the theorist is not pretending. The theorist is doing serious, let's suppose, scientific work, right?
A story just describes something, but a theory tries to explain something. So I see some difference. As a theory, it tries to explain how things are in the world. And it might fail to do that, but then it doesn't become a story. So maybe.
Well, the example of Vulcan is actually exactly that. Leverrier theorized that an intramercurial planet was perturbing the orbit of Mercury, and it turned out nothing was perturbing the orbit of Mercury other than relativity. There was no gravitational reason for this, but it was meant to explain why Mercury wasn't where they expected it to be. In fact, the real explanation was not anything about gravitational perturbance. So that was an example of a theory that was put forward to explain something, and it was mistaken, right? But I still think it's enough like a story that Leverrier referred to a hypothetical planet as Vulcan.
Okay. So, just something what I really meant before was that there's a difference between according to and as described in fiction. Because you can say Sherlock Holmes as described in the fiction does not exist in the story. And that means something different as according to the story, Sherlock Holmes does not exist in the story.
Yeah.
And therefore, that was my idea of really or in reality. And you do not need this as the abstract objects. If you use Sherlock Holmes as described in the story, it's forced to refer to some character or a real object if there is one. But if there is none, it's forced to refer to the character. But it makes it more explicit, as Maria said it.
This is a kind of theory of referential magnetism, that if there's a real thing, then it's going to refer to it.
It's a contextual thing. So if the real name Sherlock Holmes is empty, then according to your thing, Sherlock Holmes as described would be false. But it also has a true reading, and the true reading is if Sherlock Holmes refers to the fictional character. And we get the true reading. Certainly we can say that the fictional character Sherlock Holmes as described. But why do we also use? Why is it necessary that we use the name Sherlock Holmes as described in the story that it's necessary that it refers that we want to refer to the actual thing. So it could have both readings on.
I'm not sure I'm following what you're saying here, Dolph. Are you distinguishing between the name Sherlock Holmes as designating the fictional character and the phrase Sherlock Holmes as depicted in the story?
No, you said Sherlock Holmes. If it's used in an existence sentence, then it's used as a name for a real thing.
Yeah.
But it's not a real thing. It's an empty name. Therefore, in the narrow scope reading, it's not even meaningful.
Wait, so I didn't quite catch all that. So on my view, the name Sherlock Holmes is not an empty name.
Yeah, but you said the Sherlock Holmes does exist. If you say that, does one then refer by Sherlock Holmes to the fictional character?
Yeah.
Okay, then there's no magnetism needed. Then it just says Sherlock Holmes as described. Then it refers to the fictional characters.
Well, no, Sherlock Holmes as described. I'm not sure that's the term. Sherlock Holmes has depicted.
So something like that. The fictional character described in the story.
Yeah, or that occurs in the story. Yeah.
That is identical with Sherlock Holmes, also.
Yeah, that's Sherlock Holmes. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we could say it doesn't exist in the story, but that doesn't mean that according to the story, Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist in the story.
According to the stories, of course, Sherlock Holmes does exist and is a person, right? And for that reason, according to the story, Sherlock Holmes is not merely a fictional character.
Yeah. Okay. Let us. I have written it up. Maybe I cannot explain it so.
All right, let me take a look. I mean, Sherlock Holmes as described in the story does not exist in the story. Does not. Let me see if I can. Wow. Okay. Sherlock Holmes as described in the story does not exist in the story. Does not mean according to the story Sherlock Holmes does not exist in the story. Yeah, that's right. Well, hence also Sherlock Holmes as described in the story does not really exist. Sherlock Holmes as described in the story does not really exist. Does not mean, according to the story, Sherlock Holmes does not really exist. Yeah, you're right. That's right. In fact, I suppose that the sentence Sherlock Holmes as described in the story does not really exist.
Yeah.
What you're saying is, in reality, there's no one who is Sherlock Holmes as described in the story.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the point.
According to the story, Sherlock Holmes does not really exist. Sherlock Holmes refers in the as described sentences to an abstract object.
Exactly. But not in the according to.
Why do you think not in according? So in according to the story, so if I say according to the story, Sherlock Holmes is a detective.
Yeah, reading. Yeah, there's a ray reading, I agree, but there's also a deductive reading. Yeah? Then it refers to a real object of the story.
Well, I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe,
we may be disagreeing about something here.
Yeah.
In the sentence, according to the story, Holmes is a detective, it refers to the abstract object.
Yeah, that might also be true. That according to the story, it's just a wider scopus as described. That's fine.
Okay, all right. So I'm not sure if there's some issue between us here or not.
Yeah, okay. No, this was just a clarification. It was just a clarification of what I said before.
Oh, yeah.
Out and so that was not.
Yeah, no, I think I got what you were saying before.
Yeah.
I'm just not convinced that there can be an operator of that kind that you can't fold into the story. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, is there any other questions? Okay, that was it.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Oh, I'm really grateful to you for this discussion. It was very, very stimulating. Thank you very much. And again, I'm sorry I can't be there with you, but enjoy your dinner.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for organizing that thing and for making it possible that we could take part in it online.
I agree. Thank you very much.
And enjoy your barbecue. Tschüss.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
I'm going to give another strawberry thing to blend out the city.
10 minutes.
Okay, so it's time to get away. Also, the barbecue will start soon. They said in 10 minutes or so.
And it's in the garden.
Outside now, near the restaurant.
Did you book a cab?
No, we do it now.
Well, we can always get an Uber if necessary.